Welcome, everyone. I'm Meg Graff, one of the business development managers at PESI, and I'm pleased to be joined by one of our experts who will be presenting at this year's ADHD Conference, Dr. Sharon Saline, clinical psychologist, international presenter, and author. So happy to have you with us today, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Meg. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm so excited to be part of this upcoming summit. It's going to be a fantastic sort of 2 days packed with information in a great way for clinicians and other folks who work with people to learn more about ADHD.
Yes, and the link is right there for you to register for the conference at pesi.com/Sharon Saline, or there's also the QR code there for you. And Sharon's going to give us a sneak peek into her session that's coming up, and it's overcoming perfectionism and imposter syndrome with ADHD clients. So we do have a few questions that came in ahead of time, but please feel free to throw your questions in the chat, and we'll get, see which ones we could get to. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll get started with first question we have for you, Sharon. So why does perfectionism co-occur with ADHD so often? And then how do you see this show up in your clients?
That's a great question. So one of the things that we know about people with ADHD is they can be all or nothing thinkers. If something isn't completely right, then it must be a failure. And this is a trait that we also see in perfectionism. Perfectionists set unreasonable standards for themselves and constantly compare themselves negatively to other people. People with ADHD what I would call neurodivergent folks who may also have a learning disability or be considered gifted, or perhaps what we call level 1 autism as well. They often compare themselves critically to neurotypical peers, and they can be sensitive to criticism and can easily be discouraged when they don't complete goals. So there's a lot of sort of overlap between perfectionism and ADHD, a fear of disappointing others or yourself, setting unreasonable standards that you can't complete. And these kind of come together in a way that kind of lower one's self-esteem. I mean, perfectionism and imposter syndrome in my view, fall under the umbrella of social anxiety. And what we see with social anxiety, rejection sensitive dysphoria, perfectionism, and imposter syndrome is really a core sense of deficiency. I'm not okay the way I am, I don't matter. And this kind of, increases the vulnerability for people with ADHD to perfectionism.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much for that, Sharon. Is it pronounced in some clients more than others, do you feel? Is it?
I think it depends. It depends on how much anxiety a person lives with, because perfectionism is really, an ineffective coping mechanism to deal with anxiety. It's a way to control outcomes, which is a fundamental aspect of managing anxiety. I am uncertain. I don't like this feeling of uncertainty. I'm uncomfortable. I don't like this feeling of discomfort. So I'm going to try to control the outcome by making sure it turns out a particular way. And unfortunately, that's not really possible. You're not perfect. The part of the brain that tells you to be perfect isn't perfect. None of it is perfect.
I love that. Yes. So we have another one here. How does perfectionism affect motivation? What are some ways therapists can help increase their ADHD clients' motivation?
Well, it's so interesting. There are, in my book, 3 types of procrastination: perfectionist procrastination, and then avoidant procrastination, and productive procrastination. So let's talk about that first one because that's our topic for today. So what happens with people with ADHD who have perfectionist tendencies is the perfectionism initially can motivate them to get started. Like, I want to do a good job. I really want this to turn out well. So I'm eager to get started. But then when I'm working on it, it's just not turning out the way I thought it would be. And so therefore, I'm going to stop. Or I can't even begin because I know I'm not going to reach the level of quality that I want. So it's not worth trying. So I'm not going to stop. So, what we want to do with our clients who struggle with perfectionist procrastination is to break tasks down into smaller pieces and to address the underlying issue of deficiency. Unless I get it right, unless I get it this particular way, then it's not good at all. So that's both that sort of black and white thinking, but also this sense that I have to get it at this incredible level in order for me to succeed. And those are just really difficult, impossible standards. So that's how I would address it, is by breaking it down and simultaneously looking at this underlying issue, because the smaller pieces, it's easier to get started, and that underlying issue of needing everything to turn out a particular way is what's it's kind of thwarting a person's ability to do anything.
Right, right. So in terms of motivation, are there differences in how perfectionism will affect short-term, long-term goals for people?
Yes, I think it will, because if people initially feel like, oh, I'm excited about this project. So one of the challenges, let me just zoom back a bit. So one of the biggest challenges with motivation for people with ADHD is consistent inconsistency. So I don't know if I have ADHD, if I'm going to wake up today and feel like, oh, this is a productive day, I'm going to get stuff done, I'm excited, I'm motivated, I'm focused, or if this is going to be one of those days where I can really barely get anything done. And so there's a way that they don't consistently believe in themselves. They don't have that sense of, oh, you know what, I trust myself to do things. And so that actually feeds the perfectionism, because I need it to turn out in a particular way. It will make me feel better about who I am, instead of being able to just try something, see what happens, and go with the flow and figure it out. And the problem with that for people with ADHD is they don't believe that they have what it takes to figure it out as they go along. And that's that sort of self-doubt.
Thank you, Sharon. I think you may have, this is another question, but you kind of spoke to this one, is perfectionism related to anxiety, and how?
I believe that perfectionism is related to anxiety. And I this means, because living with anxiety is experiencing moments when you're aware that you're struggling, or you've messed up, but you don't necessarily know why or what's happened or how to fix it. And so this develops over time into a persistent worry. When is the next time I'm going to receive negative feedback when I wasn't expecting it? And so what happens at a young age is, people try to get it right. They try to be perfect. And that over time and into adulthood, that doesn't actually serve us, because it's not possible. What happens is that they're so much looking for validation from other people that they're not able to kind of acknowledge their own efforts and be able to feel like they have the resources internally to manage whatever occurs. So perfectionism is this, as I said earlier, sort of unhelpful coping mechanism to try to control outcomes. And it comes, that's why it's related to anxiety, because many people who have anxiety live with a desire for outcome certainty. I want to know what's going to happen. And so they're intrinsically related.
Thank you for giving us more about that. So how can therapists help their ADHD clients reduce the effects of perfectionism?
Well, that is a great question because the thing is that we want to be able to understand the different types of perfectionism. And so there's self-directed perfectionism where, I expect myself to be perfect. I hold these unrealistic expectations and then what we see is really people being very punitive in their evaluations of themselves. It's a harsh inner voice. Social perfectionism, where we think other people are judging us because we're not perfect and we need to live up to that. And that really comes from a desire for approval. And then other oriented perfectionism, where we project onto others our own standards of perfectionism that we expect them to fulfill. So the interventions for dealing with perfectionism with people with ADHD are to work initially on the psychological precursors of perfectionism. So the need to be accepted, the need to feel cared for, and the need to feel like you matter. In addition, we want to address the behavioral aspects of perfectionism, which really are rooted in what I call compare and despair. I'm going to look at what other people are doing and see myself as less than. And we see this all the time. I see this all the time with people with ADHD, Meg, particularly women who are judging themselves and putting themselves down, and even feeling like an imposter. I'm not who I present. I was, people will say, I'm. No one knows the hot mess I am inside, right? And so we have to do the cognitive piece of learning how to talk to ourselves differently, setting realistic goals, breaking goals down into manageable chunks, and do the interpersonal, the psychodynamic work that I'm talking about, of feeling like a failure, that no one really knows the bad person, quote unquote, that you are inside. I like to tell my clients what Teddy Roosevelt said, which is comparison is the thief of joy. And so our path toward greater contentment is to fill up your own approval cup instead of holding it out for others.
I love that. Thank you. Here's another one for you. What is the relationship between perfectionism and imposter syndrome, and how do you see that showing up in sessions?
Well, it's really interesting because perfectionism and imposter syndrome, I call them siblings. One is directly related to the other. You will feel like an imposter if you're not. What happens is people will feel like imposters if they're not getting things right in the way that they want. And then what we do see with imposter syndrome is that people kind of tell themselves, I'm not who I present. People don't really know the failure I am underneath. And then they run this other equation, which is if I mess up, I'm a bad person. And so there's an expectation among people who live with imposter syndrome of being judged, of being humiliated. And so they are doing everything they can to hide any vulnerability for that to occur. And so one of the things that we want to think about with imposter syndrome is, what would it be like for you to be authentic? What does it mean to be accepted for who you are, how you are? This is terrifying for a lot of people with ADHD who spent many years being told about how they were missing the mark when they didn't even know they were doing something that wasn't okay. So there's a hypervigilance about it. So they're really good at hiding their parts of themselves that they don't want people to see. The other thing that we see with imposter syndrome is that when good things happen to people who have perfectionism and imposter syndrome, they don't take it in. Like if someone says something nice to you, instead of saying, thank you, I really appreciate hearing that, they'll be like, yeah, well, it wasn't anything, or I didn't do very much, or so-and-so helped me. They'll sort of brush it off because they actually don't, in my opinion, have the neural pathways to take it in. It's like, well, if I take it in, where's it going to go? I don't have a place for it to go.
Right.
Right. And so we want to help them figure out, where is that going to go? What's it like to hold on to some genuine positivity that you're receiving?
Instead of self-doubt all the time. Yes,
Right.
that's wonderful. Well, Sharon, this was a wonderful sneak peek into your presentation at this year's ADHD Summit, where there again, you can register at PESI.com/Saline ADHD or the QR code. I want to thank you so much for joining us, all of you today. And thank you, Sharon, for joining us. And we will see you on December 12th and 13th.
Thank you, Meg. Thank you so much, PESI, for inviting me to the summit and for chatting with me today. This was fun, Meg. Let's do it again sometime.
It was fun, Sharon.